Shadcn UI is probably the most popular UI library in React. It has gained major traction in the last months and years, but since its release, there has been an ongoing debate on whether or not you should use Shadcn UI, or are you better off using another traditional UI library? And the opinions in the developer community, be it on YouTube or on X, as always, are very controversial, even on the extremes. And even I made a video quite a while ago, 2 years ago, where I talked about whether or not you should use Shadcn UI. But the thing is, a lot has changed in the last 2 years. Shadcn UI and the whole ecosystem around it changed in such a dramatic way that the things that I said back then are simply not valid anymore. So in this video, I want to give you a definitive answer on whether or not you should use Shadcn UI. Now, for context, I have been using different UI libraries in React with my clients in the last years, and I have gained some hands-on experience with these libraries that I want to supplement this video with. These are things you only find out once you are actually using these UI libraries in real products in production. So what did I get wrong 2 years ago about Headless UI libraries and Shadcn UI? What are these big changes that were introduced in Shadcn UI? And most importantly, should you still use Shadcn UI, or are you better off just using another traditional UI library? So if it's your first time watching my videos, I'm Joseph. I'm a senior developer from Hamburg, Germany. And in this channel, I try to share the lessons that I learned working as a full stack developer. Now, the first time that I came across Shadcn UI was around 3 years ago. And I can remember it clear as day on how stunned I was. I was almost addicted, just going through the docs and playing around with these clean, modern UI components. So naturally, I started using it on all of my side projects, and this is where the cracks began to show. There's a core concept in Shadcn UI that I did not fully understand at the time, and this is the concept of headless UI libraries. So what is a headless UI library and how does it differ from Shadcn UI? A headless UI library is a library that provides you with functional and accessible components like dialogues, menus, and dropdowns. But the difference here between a headless UI library and a traditional UI library is that it does not have any built-in styling. So this leaves the design part entirely in your hands. Why would anyone want to use a UI library that doesn't come with any style? Well, this can come in handy when you want full control over the visual appearance while relying on pre-built, accessible, and well-tested behavior. So famous headless UI libraries in React include Radix UI, AreaKit, React Area, Base UI, and Headless UI. So now that you understand what a headless UI library, what does it have to do with Shadcn UI? So Shadcn UI is a collection of UI components that are built on top of headless UI libraries. And please note here that I use the word collection and not library. Shadcn UI is not a traditional library because it does not ship as a package that you can install as a dependency from npm. So when you want to use a component from Shadcn UI, you add the code of a component to your repository either by copy pasting manually, but there's also actually a CLI command that you can just run, and this copies that code to your own repository. Okay, so now that you know what Shadcn UI is and the difference between Shadcn UI and Headless UI library, I want to tell you about some very common misconceptions or common concerns when you're considering adopting Shadcn UI. And for that, I want to use the statements that I personally made in that video. So the first statement, and this one is around 1 minute 12, and this is about the difficulty of design. So trying to style the UI components yourself as a developer can be very challenging. Second statement, around 1.5 minutes. And this is about the code ownership. And the claim here is that you don't truly own all of the code of the UI components since you're using a headless UI library under the hood, which basically just opens the door for all the disadvantages that you have with normal UI libraries. So it can be abandoned, and there's no guarantee that the headless UI library that you're using under the hood is bulletproof or doesn't have any bugs. The third statement, which is around the 2 minute mark, is about the verbosity of the code. due to heavy use of a React pattern called composite components. And here I gave a clear example comparing a pagination component from the UI library Mountain with the Shadcn UI implementation. And as you can clearly see, there is quite a bit of verbosity when it comes to the Shadcn UI code, or at least it's a bit longer. The fourth point is regarding the customizability of traditional UI libraries. And the point here is that since these modern UI libraries like Shadcn UI and Mountain offer enough customizability, you don't really need to burden yourself with Shadcn UI. So in order to assess these statements, we have to talk about the latest changes in Shadcn UI. There are 5 updates that have changed the playing rules. First, you have project initialization. Believe it or not, setting up Shadcn UI in a fresh repository hasn't always been straightforward. And not that long ago, it took me around 20 minutes to just set up Shadcn UI in the Tanstack Start project. There's also a video if you want to see me struggle over there. But now there is a CLI command that you can just use to bootstrap your project using your framework of choice. And I'm not just talking about Next.js or Vite, but also Tanstack Start, Laravel, React Router, or even Astro. And this brings us to the second point, which is customizability. Now, one of the most common critiques about Shadcn UI is that all of the websites using it look more or less the same. Now, don't get me wrong, Shadcn UI has always been extremely customizable. And of course, you could always make your website look drastically different from the rest simply by changing the global CSS variables. And these are, by the way, used throughout the UI components. But this whole process of adjusting these CSS variables was quite tedious. It took a lot of tinkering with these variables until somehow your website looked good. And this meant that a lot of people simply skipped this step and just decided to adjust the color or the main primary color used throughout the app and call it a day. But now there is a new create page where you can tweak the theme and see how all of these changes show up in the UI components. And by the way, if you're gonna be using this page after watching this video, I actually asked for a feature to be added here, which is that once you hover over any of customization options, then you can see the preview live. That's something that I asked Shadcn for on Twitter, and he just answered, I don't know, within 2 hours or something like that, and just implemented it. Boom, it's done. So that was also pretty cool. Now back to this edit page. Not only is it easier to change your whole theme, but you also get like a CLI command that you can copy and paste to either create a new project, or you can also apply this theme to an existing app using Shadcn UI. Now, speaking of theming, the theming options have also drastically expanded. For example, one of the things that you can now configure is which icon library is used. I'm personally a big fan of tabular icons. I've always mentioned them in my videos, and I'm happy that I don't have to change the icons manually anymore. On top of that, you can also choose the color and appearance of menus. You can set a global style that affects the scaling of your whole app. So now each app that is built using Shadcn UI can look completely different. Now the next point is where things start to get really interesting, because this doubles down on the whole core principle of Shadcn UI, which is how to share your code directly without having to create and publish a library on NPM. And that is the registry. So the registry is a code distribution model added quite recently where third-party UI libraries can publish their UI components, which you can install by running the same CLI command as you run to add components. And this has opened the door to so many community components that are not part of the official Shadcn registry. For example, newly I needed an image comparison tool for a background remover that I built in a previous video, and I just used the registry for that. I also needed a component to have a progressive blur in a UI component, and I just found a component that I installed using this registry command. Now, I suspect that the original idea behind the registry was to open the platform to approved third-party UI libraries, but there is nothing stopping you from sharing any kind of file within any framework, since under the hood, you're simply copying the public code from a GitHub repository. Now comes the biggest change of all. So earlier, the UI components of Shadcn UI used to be based on a headless component library called Radix UI. And for a while, there has been a lot of talks about the future and the maintainability of Radix UI, since Radix UI has been acquired by WorkOS, and a lot of the maintainers have shifted their focus on another headless UI library, which is called Base UI. And this has created a lot of, let me call it drama, a lot of worries for everyone who is using Shadcn UI, since it was using Radix UI under the hood. But luckily, Shadcn also added support to Base UI in Shadcn UI. And this practically adds another layer of insurance. So if the Radix UI project is ever abandoned, you can easily just make the switch to Base UI with minimal code changes in your app. And by the time that I'm actually writing down this video, I noticed that there has been a new third headless UI library that has been added to Shadcn UI. Now, Shadcn UI is not the only technology that has evolved in the last years. There are two major shifts that have fundamentally changed how we build React applications. The majority of developers do use AI to different degrees to generate React code. In my experience, Cloud Code, for example, is extremely good at using Shadcn UI components. And I have a theory that since a lot of LLMs have been trained on public GitHub repositories and a large portion of them use Shadcn UI, that's the reason basically why Cloud Code is so good at it. But there's also a very popular UI skill that you can install. This is actually the official skill for Shadcn UI. And this one basically tells your agents how to add components from multiple registries. It enforces the composition rules of your components and even helps you choose the right components. Now, the second major change in our dev industry is that Tailwind basically won. 5 years ago, utility first CSS was probably seen as a bit controversial, but today Tailwind has just become a default, and it doesn't even matter if you're in React or even outside of the JavaScript ecosystem, Tailwind is almost everywhere. And this is obviously relevant here because Shadcn UI uses Tailwind under the hood, and if you want to style your components, then obviously it's easier to do that using Tailwind CSS as well. So now back to the main question. Should you use Shadcn UI or are you better off using another traditional UI library? So for that, let's go back to the first statement, and this is about the difficulty of designing your own component library. So my answer here is that it heavily depends on whether you're talking about Shadcn UI or headless UI libraries. And obviously, if you're going to build your own UI library as a solo developer on top of a headless UI library, then sure, it does take a lot of time and effort. And even if you use AI, you will still need to spend some time reviewing the design manually and make sure that it's all consistent and visually appealing. But if you're using Shadcn UI as your starting point, then you have a head start. With the new online theme editor and the possibility to apply themes to existing projects, this big disadvantage that was often attributed to Shadcn UI, which is that all websites built with Shadcn UI look the same, is completely flipped. The design variants that you can now produce are even more diverse if you compare it with other UI libraries. Okay, so let's move on to the second point, which is about code ownership. And here the worry is that what happens if the underlying headless UI library is abandoned? And actually, you don't have to worry about that because it's literally just happened. Radix UI is not being actively maintained. So Shadcn UI first introduced Base UI as an alternative to Radix UI. And now it's even the default UI library. And like I told you a few minutes ago, there's also a third library that has just been added. So if Base UI is not maintained anymore, there's literally no reason why you wouldn't be able to use another headless UI library under the hood. Okay, so the next one is a bit of a hard one, and this is about the verbosity of the code. If you recall the code example I showed you in the beginning of the video, which is about creating a simple pagination component, you can see that the code using the UI library Mantine is way shorter. And this pattern which is called composite components, which I made a previous video about, by the way, is used almost everywhere throughout Shadcn UI. And this includes things like models, dropdowns, and even the newly added components that are made specifically for creating AI chats and stuff like that, like bubbles or file attachments. Now, there are two things that kind of forced me to accept this pattern, although I was quite resistant in the beginning. The first being I don't write all the code by hand anymore. So most of the initial code that I create, and I mean going from like an empty file to like 80% of the way, I use Cloud Code. And I don't have the problem of like having to look up the exact structure of the composite components that I have to follow when using Shadcn UI. Second, and that's something that I hate to admit, the composite components pattern kind of grew on me. And what makes this pattern like so incredibly useful is that since you have access to like every part of the component tree you're using, it just opens the door to so much flexibility. So you can easily adjust the layout or the colors or the gaps of any component because you can look inside of the components. I don't know if I explained this good enough, but if I have to choose between code that is a little bit more verbose but flexible, or a clean, squeaky clean code that is stiff and less flexible, then I'm definitely gonna go the flexible way. Now, when it comes to customizability, it's true that most UI libraries like Mountain do offer quite a good amount, but obviously you can never match the level of Shadcn UI because you can just change the code of your whole components to make it match exactly the design that you want. Now let's finish it off with probably one of the most important arguments when choosing a piece of technology, and that is ecosystem compatibility. So to understand why this matters, I want to tell you about my experience trying to do something that should have been pretty straightforward, but it was quite a struggle. So I wanted to use Mountain UI with React hook form, which is the most popular form library in the React ecosystem at the moment. The problem there was that the input APIs were different. So in Mountain, the component text input has a prop called onChange, but it gives you the new string value as a callback value. And that is different than the HTML input elements that gives you an event with a value stored inside events that target that value. Now, this sounds like a tiny detail, but it actually affects how easily other libraries work together. So instead of plugging React hook form directly into the input component coming from Mountain, I had to install another third-party library just to make it work. And yeah, I get it, it's not the end of the world, but I also believe that every new dependency just creates more friction, adds more code, and it makes future maintenance just a little bit harder. So what I do when I'm choosing any piece of technology, I don't look just at the features of that piece of technology in isolation. I try to ask myself, how does it work with other tools that I already use? The best technology is often not the one that looks best on its own, but it's something that fits very nicely with the whole ecosystem around it. So if you enjoyed watching the video, please consider sharing it with someone who you want to persuade to use Shadcn UI, and I'll see you in the next one.